Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Space Florida is a leading aerospace economic development organization dedicated to strengthening Florida's position as a global leader in aerospace research, investment, exploration, and commerce. As the state's premier aerospace agency, Space Florida is committed to attracting and expanding the next generation of space industry businesses. Leading that mission is Rob Long. As Space Florida's president and CEO, Rob has over 25 years of leadership experience in the aerospace industry. His expertise spans launch operations, logistics, and spaceport management. His strategic vision aims to position Florida as a global hub for aerospace commerce. Rob, thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
Yeah, great. Great to be here, Tom.
Tell me, first of all, what is Space Florida's mission, other than what we just kind of described, and its role in the aerospace industry?
Yeah, you touched on it. We're the state's aerospace financing and development authority. So what that really means is we endeavor to work with aerospace companies, and the definition of aerospace is pretty broad. But we work with aerospace companies in a partnering arrangement that endeavors to bring them here to the state to help them grow. And we do that through various tools, largely through financial tools that we have at our disposal to ultimately lower the cost of capital, the cost of moving and growing here into the state of Florida. And that's, kind of something that we've developed over time and really provides a pretty nice benefit to a company when they're really trying to grow. And obviously we the state and the areas where they grow into then reap the economic benefits from that. So that's one side of our business. The other side is what we call our spaceport authority. And that sounds and it is very similar to some of the other port authority roles that you might see out there in an airport or a seaport. We do it for a spaceport, and it's something that we are definitely growing, and we work very closely with partners at NASA and the United States Space Force here at Cape Canaveral to help build out the infrastructure necessary to ensure that the spaceport here can support the capacity of launches that are required to meet the demand signal from that side of the industry as well. So, those are our two main lines of business. But ultimately, we also are very much involved across the spectrum, whether it's workforce, all the enabling functions that are necessary for a business to grow and to thrive in Florida. We want to make sure that we're there to come alongside them and support them really, in three main areas. We like to say that, we have an unmatched financial toolkit, which I mentioned earlier. Obviously, we have an unbeatable location. There's number one, there's more launches to space happen here at Cape Canaveral than anywhere else in the country. And usually most places in the world can't compete with us. And that's obviously just here at Cape Canaveral, but really our purview spans the entire state, and there's opportunities across the entire state. And we do that with an expertise here in Space Florida that I would argue is second to none.
Now, you're a government agency. Talk about your relationship a little bit with the Florida legislature and kind of how that whole process works.
Yeah, Space Florida is a very unique organization overall. We are a public corporation that is chartered in statute by the Florida legislature. We actually are not in a traditional state agency, if you will. We have a little bit different arrangement. We have our independent board of directors that I report to as a CEO. They help guide us strategically as we go after the mission of increasing aerospace economic growth here in the state. We are under contract with the Department of Commerce, however, so we have a wonderful partnership with the Florida Department of Commerce and helping, mutually to grow the economy here in the state. And then we also have a great partnership with the Florida Department of Transportation. And then, as you may know, that space is actually an official mode of transportation here in the state of Florida, and it's we're the only state that actually recognizes that as such. And in doing so, that created a program with the Florida Department of Transportation where we partner on investments in infrastructure for spaceports. And so it's a great partnership. It's Spaceport is a unique organization that there is nothing else like it in structure across the country, and it's been pretty powerful to date.
What types of products and services then does Space Florida offer to aerospace companies?
Our main, I guess you would say, service in terms of helping companies grow or expand here into the state of Florida, move here to the state of Florida, I would say is largely centered around some of the financial tools that we have at our disposal. We do something that's called conduit financing, where we act as a party that comes alongside a company if they need to finance, let's say, a facility to grow or something like that, in which we then help them go to the market and act as somewhat of an intermediary in that role. And then because we are a public corporation and we act as a governmental body in some regards, we also have access to certain exemptions and things like that, that depending on the situation can apply. So really the goal for all of that, though, on the financial side is to reduce the cost of capital for these companies. So we can stack the benefits, whether that's certain tax programs, whether that's funding from that might come through, let's say, what we call the Spaceport Improvement Program, which is the Florida Department of Transportation program that we partner on. There are other programs and things in the state. So as you start to stack those financial benefits, that reduces the overall cost of capital, which can be very powerful. And it's also just not some quick cash and a ribbon cutting, right? It is actually something that we partner, and we endeavor always to enter into a long-term strategic partnership with these companies. And we see that over time recently really coming to fruition, where we'll partner with a company who is, let's say, builds a new building or a new headquarters here in the state of Florida. And then when they want to expand, they come right back to us, and then we work through that with them. And so they're continuing to build on those relationships. So that's probably, I would say, one of the main areas in terms of our toolkit that is important. But like I said, we also have the Spaceport line of business, and that really is really intended to look at the infrastructure that's needed to operate launch complex, if that's something that is beneficial to the community. But really, I like to say that we're really acting as a partner with whether it's federal agencies, whether that's local groups, in order to make sure that the space transportation infrastructure here in the state of Florida is second to none.
You're relatively new to Space Florida, but obviously not to the aerospace industry. So give me a little bit about your background and how you got started in space.
Yeah, I think we kind of all, at least when I talk to colleagues in the space industry, we kind of have our origin stories that we share. Mine, goes all the way back to being a kindergartner, actually, and seeing one of the maiden voyages of the space shuttle come back from and landing in California on the back of a 747 when I was living in Texas. And I remember that to this day. It's one of the great memories. And that really just spawned an interest in space. And, I went through growing up in school, went to college, and ended up going into the Air Force from there. And a little bit by chance, I ended up in the space career field in the Air Force. So I spent 23 years in the Air Force doing space-related things, doing things around launch, doing things around space policy, some industrial work, working with companies in the arena. And then when the U.S. Space Force stood up, those of us that were in the space career field in the Air Force transitioned over to Space Force, got to be part of that initial cadre of people standing up the Space Force. So I did that for a little while longer, and then I retired from the military this last summer. And this opportunity came up, and threw my name in the hat for that, and was pretty fortunate to get selected and to transition into this. And it's been a great transition for me. There's so much about what Space Florida does that's like I said earlier, unique. But at the same time, I've been in many bases across the country, and the relationship that let's say the Space Force here has with Space Florida to try to really move the needle on improving the capabilities here is like no other, and was definitely appealing.
And my origin story goes back to the summer of 1969, watching at summer camp the Apollo 11 moon landing. So, and that's a memory that has stuck with me for my entire life. It's really
Yeah,
it was
it's
really
funny.
life changing.
Everyone I talk to has one of those stories in this,
Yeah.
especially in the space. If you're in a career that's space oriented.
Introduce me, if you would, to some of the members of your team, the key members, and what their roles are.
Yeah, we're set up like I'll call it maybe a mid cap corporation, right? So we have a CFO who is making sure we're doing all the financial stuff and we're keeping on track from contracting, accounting, pretty standard, that you'd expect. We do have a chief investment officer who is really making sure if we're going to enter into some of these project deals with companies, we owe it to the taxpayer of the state because we're using state funds to make sure that whatever those deals are, that we've done our due diligence. So they kind of look through that entire process. And then we have others that are very much focused on understanding what the capital markets look like and how are we going to go get the best financing arrangements for some of these companies that are really looking to grow. And then we have folks on our spaceport business unit side. So you can imagine we're very much structured along our two lines of business. We're very much right now, if you look at the organization as a whole, when I first started, it was kind of trying to understand, where do we need to take the organization in the future. And the first thing that really was apparent was really we needed to meet the demand signal from industry. We have about 150 projects in our pipeline right now. And, that's about a 3 to 4x increase over the last 5 years. And we haven't really grown in terms of manpower. And so we're really starting to see that we need to start adding some people to be able to accommodate that demand signal, which is a great problem to have. But as with anything, when you scale an organization, there's always going to be some growing pains that come along with that. But that's kind of the fun part about the job. And then it also gives us a chance to look into the future and really see what the future holds for both aerospace industry at large and some of the areas of the market that we want to target. We are very blessed right now that we don't need to do much marketing. We actually have plenty of business coming in without that, but I think there's a lot more to do. And so I'm looking forward to kind of really making that a focus in the next couple of years to really grow the organization so that we can go after even more of that market share.
Which kind of leads me into my next question to talk a little bit about customer acquisition. What are your primary target customers? Are they startups? Are they established companies? Do you get a good mix of both? And then how do you pitch the state of Florida? Because everybody's looking for the best deal. So how do you pitch the state of Florida to these companies who are looking for a place to establish their space business?
Yeah, our goal is to really look across that entire spectrum that you mentioned, from early startups and even all the way back, into the universities and on the science and technology and the early R&D side, where you're trying to really get a foothold into some of those areas where the new technology of the future will turn into the next startup and the next great company. But at the same time, we're definitely engaged from the startup side. We do a lot with capital accelerator programs. We work with Florida Venture Forum and other similar organizations to make sure that we're involved in some of those early aerospace companies. We have partnerships with like Israel, for example, where we partner between, we encourage partnerships, and then there's some funding that comes along with that. So that's a very much on the early side. And then, small mid-cap companies all the way to the largest Fortune 500 companies. We have the ability to deal with all of those. And the pitch we often make is that our toolkit can adjust to support all of those. If you're a large, well-capitalized company, you may not need financing because you're going to do it internally. Well, that's great. You won't need that part of our toolkit, but there's a lot about what we do in terms of being the lease owner or owner of the facility that then correlates to certain tax advantages, or taking things off balance sheets, those kinds of accounting advantages. So we can do that for large companies. Like a Blue Origin is a great example of that. But there's other companies, that maybe they've got as much private equity investment maybe as they need. And so they want to look at financing, and then we can kind of come alongside them. We really try to be kind of the experts in this area, both from a space infrastructure, spaceport side of things, all the way through all financing of the entire aerospace industry. And when you ask the question about where we think the future might be market-wise, I mean, there's some definite ones that will always kind of be in our wheelhouse. Obviously, the launch side of things and satellite manufacturing is always going to be something we're going to really look very carefully at making sure we're involved as deeply as we can be in that part of the market. But there's others, aircraft manufacturing. There's an interesting the MRO, maintenance, repair, and overhaul activities. Florida is a hub for that, and we continuously get interest in that. So those are kinds of things we always want to make sure we're staying in front of. And then as you look into the future, advanced air mobility, eVTOL, things like that. I think we hear often that Florida is a very appealing location for some of those activities and companies as that market grows over time. So those are some of the areas we're looking at. But really, it's all about, like I said earlier, kind of meeting the current demand and ensuring that we're servicing our clients and are providing the best services we can for our clients.
My guest is Space Florida President and CEO Rob Long on the Ex Terra Podcast. Take a moment right now to click subscribe to make sure you don't miss any of our podcasts, or if you're watching on YouTube, any of the videos from Ex Terra, the Journal of Space Commerce. Rob, Florida is home to a lot of spaceports. You alluded to that. We have one here in Jacksonville that hasn't launched anything to space yet, but it has the authorization to do that now. How did these spaceports contribute to the overall space economy?
Yeah, every spaceport is part of the larger, what we call our space transportation network here in the state of Florida. I like to look at it as if you're any kind of network, you're going to have maybe a critical node, and that critical node is Cape Canaveral right now, just because of there's 70 years of investment in infrastructure at Cape Canaveral, and it's one of the few places really in the world that can do what it has the land and the capability to do what it can do to support launches. But when you take a step back and you really look at that as a network or a system, you want to have other parts of that network that can either provide resilience to your network or provide other alternatives to your network, so that if Cape Canaveral is your critical node and you want to make sure it can be at full capacity, you don't want anything to disrupt that. And that's where I think that places like Cecil, like you mentioned, and other places across the state can really act in the near term as those places where I like to use engine testing as an example. If you're testing rocket engines, you also need to have a clear area around that test site. You may not want to do that next to launches, because that's going to cause them to stop or to slow down. So where else in our network then, someplace like Cecil, for example, maybe is a good location where we'd say, hey, all engine testing would be maybe at this one location. And then over time, maybe that's satellite manufacturing, and where could you put satellite manufacturing so that, if you have maybe a hurricane, for example, you want to make sure that you've offset some of that so not all your eggs are in one basket. And so that's what we're going to do. We added two territory designations. The legislature designated Homestead and Tyndall bases as spaceport territory. That allows us to start the process of incorporating them into the network. It'll take some time to do that, of course. But what it does is it allows us to look strategically across the whole state to determine, are there other launch sites that we might need to help in somewhere in the future when Cape Canaveral, if it ever gets full, you're going to want to have an ability to offload some of that. And what would that look like? And then over time, eventually, the safety clear areas and things like that will start to lessen over time, just like airports do, in terms of homes being built around an airport, for example. So we'll see that occur over time, and we really want to make sure that Florida is postured to take advantage of that. And that's where having all these different locations in our spaceport, our space transportation network, will be important.
What about the economic impact on job growth, economic growth, technological advancement, those kinds of things?
Yeah, I mean, the economic impact is really one of the key metrics that we look at to make sure that, when we want to say we provide value back to the state, that's one of them. And if you look at the life, about the, first 10 or so years of Space Florida's existence, we had about a $6 billion economic impact, which is a great number. And it's pretty inspiring when you think about the numbers of jobs and the amount of not just direct jobs, but the induced jobs that come along with companies moving and growing. into the state of Florida. But on top of that, when you look ahead, we're forecasting, about another $1 billion a year in investment in the coming years. So, when I mentioned that project pipeline, that's not slowing down right now, and so we're really trying. But $1 billion a year is obviously great, and we want to increase that over time. And so that's kind of our intention going forward.
You kind of alluded to this, but let's talk about it a little bit more in depth, because Florida remains the only place in the U.S. that launches manned space flights to orbit. I know they do some suborbital flights some other places, but we're the only place that is going to orbit from U.S. soil. But are you seeing the potential for competition in that market, and how far in the future might that be?
Yeah, I think there's always going to be competition. I mean, that's the beauty of a free market system, right? Is you want competition, and it helps not only get a better deal for the customer, but at the same time, I think it helps innovation and it helps grow. So there's probably always going to be some competition out there. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, we have the benefit of maybe a 70-year head start in terms of investing in the infrastructure here to support that. Obviously, having great partners like the Kennedy Space Center, for example, who's really driving human spaceflight and human exploration, and then of course the commercial market is taking advantage of that. I think those are some of the relationships that exist here in Florida that don't exist elsewhere. But in the long run, I think it's ultimately a good thing to be able to build out that network. We wouldn't have a very useful airport or air transportation network if we only had one or two airports across the country. So, and then eventually when if we ever get to kind of a horizontal takeoff and landing technology and becomes mature enough, I think that'll still put us in a good position. But that's really when it comes back to, as I said earlier, us here at Space Florida really having the ability to sit back, look, take a little visionary look at what the future holds, build out some infrastructure there so that we are, if nothing else, a first mover. Maybe we can help set some standards, and then helps and really to help the industry at large grow.
How important is Florida's legacy in manned spaceflight launches? Is it, companies will look and they'll say, well, they've been doing it there for a long time, they must know how it's done. Should we take a risk on some place that is not quite as proven? Is that a factor that could go into those decisions?
Yeah, I'd probably actually have to ask the companies usually, but I would say generally there's a certain cachet that does come along with launching from the site where Apollo 11 launched, or where the first Americans launched into space, right? So if you're a space geek like myself and you get to see some of that stuff firsthand down here, it doesn't get old, and I think there is an appeal to that. But at the same time, I do think companies are going to be business oriented, and they want to make sure that they are doing the best for either their shareholders or for the company itself, and we want to provide the different options and services that the market will demand as we grow. And so while I think we do benefit a little bit from the cachet that's associated with Kennedy Space Center and Cape Canaveral Spaceport Station and the history that has been here, and the infrastructure, obviously, that has built up as part of that history, we definitely aren't looking at it as a certain thing in the future. And we're going to continue to keep pushing on growing, building extra capability, and making sure that, Florida remains kind of that interplanetary hub for space commerce, if you will.
Space Florida has been making significant strides in commercial spaceport operations, not least of which was the recent lunar landing of the Intuitive Machines Nova-C and Lone Star data holdings. Can you talk a little bit about those projects?
Sure. Especially the Intuitive Machines effort. I think NASA's been leading a lot on the commercial services side of encouraging that. Different capabilities, whether that was commercial launch services. Now they're doing commercial lunar services. And so I think from our standpoint, it's great to be able to partner with them, come alongside and help build out whatever infrastructure that is required to continue to support those kinds of missions, and look for opportunities. On the Intuitive Machines launch, we had worked with a company called Lone Star Data, who put the first data repository on the moon, and was able to actually transmit data back and forth, demonstrating secure data storage on the moon itself. So, Florida spawns these kind of creative companies who are doing these kinds of things, and so it obviously makes it easier for us to work with them, because they're so creative, and then we just can kind of come alongside and be there to help them. But at the same time, I think it's something that is important about kind of this ecosystem that exists here in the state of Florida.
If I can throw in a shameless plug, we'll be having Chris Stott from Lone Star Data Holdings on the podcast here in the next couple of weeks. So hopefully folks will tune in to hear more about that too.
Yeah, I'd encourage everyone to listen. Chris is a great guy.
What trends, Rob, do you see shaping the future of the space industry, and how is Space Florida preparing for them?
I think when I look ahead and what trends, I think there will always be a tendency to be very visionary about what the future holds, which is a good thing. And we want to be thinking 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road. And we're going to continue to do that. But I also, at the same time, like to emphasize that I try not to overcomplicate space as a mode of transportation or space transportation. It's not that different conceptually from air travel or sea travel or sea transportation and air transportation or rail or road for that matter. It's getting something, cargo, people, from point A to point B. In our case, it's point A starts usually on the Earth and point B ends up in space somewhere. So as we look ahead, we want to continue to normalize that approach. And then on top of that, we want to start looking at what is needed in that transportation or logistics network to build out the entire network that will go from not only ground to space, but in space itself. So moving around between orbits and different areas in space, going to the moon, going to other parts of the solar system. If, in the future, that will be something that we will have to consider. And then I also like looking at what I call the through space piece of that, which is whether you call it point to point transportation using space, space launch or something like that. Those are all things that I think maybe not in the next 5 years, but, you start looking 10 years and beyond. Those are all capabilities and technologies that I think are realistically going to come down to fruition. And we want to make sure we're postured to take advantage of those, so that we'll start putting some of those building blocks in place now.
And it's getting more and more like the more traditional modes of transportation, in that you don't have to build a new ship every time you want to ship something across the ocean. And we're getting to the point where you don't have to build a new rocket all the time, which is a big step forward.
That's exactly right. And that's the kind of innovation you would expect, as you go through this, is that whether it's SpaceX or other companies that are starting to realize that if you can start to get into that, the train to space or something like that, and you have predictable schedules, you have predictable capacities, and you start driving down costs, that's going to continue to unlock space or normalize maybe a space as a mode of transportation.
Rob, we're just about out of time, and you've kind of done this in your last answer, but I wanted you to be a little bit more specific and look out, if you might. And we ask this question of all of our guests, the next 10 to 15 years in space commerce, and tell us about how you see your role in that.
Yeah, I think, to keep expanding, I guess, on what I said earlier, I see us, Space Florida, and the state of Florida as being in a unique position and having the opportunity to really help shape what the future of especially space transportation is. And that's why I like to include, when you talk transportation or infrastructure or spaceport infrastructure, both of those things oftentimes come back to, what are you going to do on the ground? What kind of launch pads do you need? What kind of roads and payload processing facilities? And in our case, seaports, for example, are going to be necessary to support launch. Our goal in the next probably 10 to 15 years is to make sure that we are accounting for what's the on-orbit infrastructure for that space transportation network. What does that look like? Let's help define that, whether it's going to be, do you need fuel depots in space? Do you need servicing capabilities in space? Do you need on-orbit tugs that are going to move things around? That's just another version of transportation. So as we work with companies that are interested in that space, whether it's on-orbit servicing and maneuver, some of those technologies, or interplanetary movement of goods and services, then we want to kind of define what that demand looks like, what's the requirements for such a network, and then work backwards. And what do we need to start putting in place now? Some of that's going to be the infrastructure, the hard infrastructure. Some of that's going to be policy, and some of it's going to be regulatory to understand, what are the things you need to do. I just saw, I think it was the Office of Science and Technology Policy came out with a proposal to, standardize time, lunar time, mm-hmm. right? So those are some simple things that you don't necessarily think about when you're really concentrated on the technology side. But those are some of the areas that we're definitely looking to to, act as a test case, if nothing else, to try some things out, see what makes sense. And then either if it's a federal agency to take over, or if we can do that here at the state level, we're certainly interested in doing that.
And we could probably do an entire half hour on policy and legislation, but we're out of time for this. So hopefully you'll come back and we'll have that discussion another time.
Certainly. Yeah, you're right. There's a lot to unpack there.
Rob Long is the president and CEO of Space Florida. Rob, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
That is going to do it for this edition of the Ex Terra Podcast. You can subscribe to the audio version of the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Audible, and many other popular podcasting platforms. Be sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any of our podcasts or any of our other videos. You can get daily updates on space commerce by subscribing to the Journal of Space Commerce on Substack at www.xterrajsc.com. And one thing more, be sure to connect with us on LinkedIn and follow us on X at XTerraJSC. Until next time, I'm Tom Patton. Thanks for joining us.
I wanna go faster, faster. Hands in the air, we're gonna crash. Searching for the answers like Galileo through his looking glass. Thirst for reason. Our dreamer's eyes we gaze into a sense of purpose, know my view. Like finding water on the moon.